can do it.
Yep.
All right, so I'm recording, and let's see if we can do a quick overview of the agenda. And I'm going to ask one or two people to see if you can recap our discussion from last week. And let's see how far we can get. So in the notes document, which I believe everybody should have, we've built the agenda. Let's see, I'm gonna paste it here. This is the 5th of December. So we are following up on a conversation last week about the expected output representations for HSDS, which verges onto our conversations about the future of HSDA, our API protocols. So this week we are going to recap last week's discussion, bump a tentative decision that I think we provisionally reached last week against some questions about how that would practically work. And Mike has offered up some questions about how this would work in the UK. And so want to assess this provisional decision from a few angles with regards to the challenges of essentially enabling multiple output representations and saying, you know, you could do either this or that as a mode for standardization. This gets us part of the way, I think, into the discussion that we've been asymptotically working towards all this time, which is about the API protocols. If we land on this particular proposal, then I think we only have some minor issues with regards to API protocol development, like pagination and error messages and stuff like that to sort through. That is my impression, but I want to check that assumption. And we have a list of other remaining issues in our agenda that we expect this work group to get through. We've listed them all out. It can be a running list. I don't expect us to get through everything today. If we got through half of it, it would be terrific. So we want to review the final open issues in the schema, for which there's a forum discussion that's been a few messages deep, talk about the mechanism for deprecation, and talk about the implications for documentation, how all this will be documented. We have a first version of documentation of the 3.0 proposal, and we want to look a little bit beyond that to think about what kind of guidance and tutorials might be helpful or even necessary. We want to get clear on how we'll sort out a change log of this version and previous ones. We want to check back in on our conversation about profiling and extensions, which I think we've reached a provisional decision around, and we want to make sure we understand that. And actually, I might move that above the documentation improvements, because I think there might be some implications for documentation around that. And then finally, tooling, which also I'm going to move above documentation. So I don't expect us to get all the way through that. Let's take some time recapping in more detail last week's conversation about the format, the output representations. Before we jump into that, any questions about that agenda or issues that I've missed that you want to make sure, or questions that you want to make sure get answered during our time together today? Okay, cool. Let's see if somebody can recap our provisional decision from last week and talk about the challenges, the reasons for that decision, the challenges, and then Mike, I'm going to ask you to recap the discussion we've been having since then about how this plays up against Open Referral's UK's current approach to API validation. And then we'll see if there's any other angles around which we want to interrogate this decision from. So David, would you like to recap where we are on the conversation about output representations? And if you have any other documentation that we should be pointing people towards, let me know.
No, I hope, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, so I hope basically that the proposal that I put at the bottom of the notes about what is a minimal accepted is all we need to really discuss. And I just wanted to see whether, like, that's basically that is like the summary of last week's meeting is like what I put into words, like all the stuff that's been gathered, and also talking to Mike on in the forum. That's sort of like my final sort of a proposal about what we should reach. The rationale behind it is that we do want like publishers to produce data in certain formats for like interoperability, federation, all the other reasons to sort of standardize on output representation. But we also don't want to like restrict people to be doing too much data, so that there's that complaint about sort of HSDA that you've got to produce all these loads of endpoints to be sort of compliant, and it's not clear. So we want like a minimal sort of set of things that we can say then actually you're compliant to, and from that therefore we can build like validation tooling or other tooling based off those. So we need like a base point. If we just say, oh, you can produce it in any representation you like as long as it's like fits to a data model, the HSDS, that isn't good enough. I feel that isn't good enough as a standardization text. So the idea, instead of like just having one, which essentially was data packages before, we have a list of ones that we recommend, and any one is okay, but it was like like trying to get to a minimal list of those, and if there's any that we're missing, you can add them, but we need to be conscious about if we add too many, it restricts interoperability and federation, all those kind of things.
Yeah. And so to recap, the set of recommended output representations, of which one would be necessary, are a data package defined by data package JSON, and or a service JSON, and or a service endpoint. Like one of those three, basically.
Yeah, or an organization, because the idea was that you could also have an organization file or an organization endpoint. All of those, we won't say they're like thoroughly recommended, but if you want to do that, that's acceptable as well, because some people, there was a lot of pushback about not having an organization perspective.
Okay. I see. So the proposal is any of these will suffice. Data package or service JSON or service API endpoint are recommended, but an organization JSON or an organization endpoint also suffices.
It should be okay. Yeah. Okay. And in terms of the service endpoint, you can have it either a big list of service objects, which is not what Referral UK do, if you want to do it that way, or you can have an endpoint which basically gives you a limited amount of data for each endpoint, and then have another endpoint where you get the full detail about a service, which is essentially what Referral UK do. And both those options for organization and services are also good. And that's what currently I think is minimum compliance for Referral UK. And I think that's like what we're saying, that everyone has to do one of those things to say you're compliant. And
so I want to hear from others. We've got a good take on this from Mike, who has a set of real world implementations. I also want to make sure that folks in the US, like Sarah and I chatted. Sarah, I want to make sure that I do think you'll have a very valuable perspective on this from Eric's perspective. I want to make sure that you're able to understand and weigh in. If we haven't made it understandable, then we haven't done our job yet. I have questions about, if we have all these different options and people publish in different ways, what are the challenges to interoperability and how do we mitigate those risks? And I think to some extent, the risks you're saying could be mitigated by tooling that could convert from one to the other. So Referral could produce tools that could take a data package and easily convert it into a service JSON or an API endpoint. So we want to assess, is that plausible? How can we test if it's feasible? Does it address the concerns? Are there other concerns we might not have covered? Okay. And David, anything else to summarize before we kick it out to people?
No, that was a good summary. That's exactly good.
Great.
So
So Mike, I know that we want to recap the discussion that we've had about how this plays out in your situation. I'll pause though, Mike, to see if anybody has questions before we jump in. Anybody have questions or issues that you want to make sure that we discuss about this? And I am
Only
taking a look
thing
at
I'd add
page check.
is that, I think that just so we're all on the same page about our goal here, is our goal basically a document that combines David's schema, HSDS 3.0 schemas with Mike's for aligning open referral and open referral UK, and like what we want to get at the end of this is a single document.
We are working
Right.
towards a single document. Yeah, I don't know if we're gonna land there by the end of this, but we
No, we will not,
but I
definitely,
think
certainly
that-
not, I'd imagine, but
Yeah.
but I think that's our goal though, right? And that
Yeah.
that document would then would go on to the docs with HSDS, reference meth
Mhm.
HSDS reference. We might have what, like HSD, maybe it would replace the HSDA section or something like that. Yeah, I mean, I guess, right, this
Potentially.
whole human services data API suite, HSDA, that's all like kind of the old method, right?
Yeah.
Like this would get completely replaced by this
Essentially.
document.
I see comments from Kate. Devin, was that?
Yeah, so I didn't want to interrupt because there was yeah, I mean, I put it in the chat, but basically, yeah, I completely agree with the issues with the former HSDA, or the current HSDA, and that it's just it's full of every possible endpoint, and whether it's helpful or not, and that both is intimidating and it just makes people not even want to start with it, honestly, and it's really impossible to be compliant, and it's also just honestly a waste of programmer time to do that. So
Kate, do you think that organization and service endpoints are sufficiently minimal?
I would say maybe that's too minimum. So my feeling is we've done a lot of discussion when we're talking about the standard, the HSDS standard. What were our main use cases? Like what are the things that people are generally trying to accomplish? And I think we've got a reasonable set of things that more than one person is trying to accomplish, like that, where we can see that same pattern of use case over and over again everywhere, like internationally and in different sectors. And if we can't take each of those and say, here is how someone's going to accomplish their needs, then we don't have enough. Then it's not good enough to be minimum, in my opinion. It's too minimum. Then we have to be able to say, if someone implements this, then every single major use case we've identified could be effectively served by this minimum set. Otherwise, to me, it's too minimum. Then we're going the other way. And the other thing that I want to see, that I'm desperate to see, because I'm constantly begging people to implement this after the fact, is reconciliation tools, meaning easy ways for me to tell whether I have the correct data set up to date, so that I can figure out if I have things that I shouldn't have, if I'm missing things. Like, I need that easy way to say kind of an overall sanity check on my data. And that needs to work for any of the ways in which we determine what the shared set is. So the big problem is filtered set. So if you're working in a filtered set of data, trying to reconcile against the filtered set becomes a particular issue, but it's a common issue. And we have to recognize it's a common issue. And we have to have tools that allow people to check on the sanity of their data. Otherwise, it's trash collection, right? It's trying to figure out what has gone wrong with your data and how to fix it. In the what I see in systems without reconciliation tools is a growing pile of garbage, honestly, missing data, out of date data, duplicate data. And we need those tools to help people have useful information that is accurate. And it seems to be missing out of almost every single API that I have to touch. So that is what I want to see. And honestly, it's very, very simple. And like I say, sometimes the endpoints we might be talking about might not be the best tool, but it has to be a tool that works. Even things like pagination, I have feelings about that, because we have accuracy is and the ability to figure out if you have collected garbage is so important. Like pagination is one of the worst tools for accidentally collecting garbage or missing data, because if it's not transactional, the window shifts, then you miss things. So we need those tools, and that to me is what is missing
Okay.
out of
So-
having a minimal viable set.
Okay, so thank you, Kate. I'm going to try to make note of the pagination issue, although I think it might be a different issue. But let me check.
It is. That was just, sorry to red herring it. It was just an example of how easy it is to cause data problems and how we have to have ways to fix it.
Okay, so yes, so this is one of our use cases. It is somewhat less common than the others that we've discussed, but it is where we want to go. So yes, we need to be designing in anticipation of that. David, any initial reactions when Kate is saying we need the capacities for essentially, data set reconciliation, or those might not be served by just a service JSON or an organization JSON? Initial takes on that? Go ahead.
Theoretically, they can be served by that, because the whole idea is that service JSON contains everything related to the service and all nested objects. It's probably not something that practically it's going to be very difficult for people to do that in a complete way, but it definitely is possible, because you're saying that service, that's that whole and complete service. So all you need is like a new service and a change date, and then you can update your whole database with the latest service. That's the idea of it. But as a minimum thing, if people can produce that fully nested JSON, that is ideal, because then they know exactly how to update should be able to update the whole of their system based on that. But in reality, people do different files and different small data packages with smaller bits of data from different sources, and that's a lot harder to actually fully reconcile. So I understand the problem. I don't know how we're going to solve it, because in terms of my aim is to get a minimum set, and we can definitely aim to get a perfect reconciliation set, but I can't imagine a standard ever be able to manage that aim.
Okay, and Kate's added into the
Yeah. Full data sets don't work if you're trying to move humongous quantities of data on a daily or multiple time a day basis, and you it's too impractical. We don't want to be replacing it, and in my case, we're preserving a whole bunch of associated data that is relationally attached to the records in between the different systems, and so we don't do a dump and replace of the data ever. It's all in place updates. So getting a full data set is a nightmare. That's not a thing that's a good solution.
Kate, do you have in mind, is there, given everything we've talked about, if there was one more endpoint or one more component of this that you think is minimally necessary?
Absolutely. And it's dead easy. It's basically, you need a couple of critical markers on the record. For us, we do basically a full set of what we expect in the set we're synchronizing. So that may have a filter applied, but what is considered the set that we're expected to have from the remote provider, which will include the record number, the type of record it is, the last time it was touched, who touched it. It's like reconciling your bank account. It's just a basic, I'm looking at the data I have against the data, my statement from the bank, and saying, yep, same transactions, look at the end, we got all the same stuff. Okay, we're good. Oh, something's missing. I better fix that thing that's missing and figure out what went wrong. It's actually incredibly, incredibly basic, but it allows you to fix messes before they become outrageous messes.
Okay.
Shouldn't that be, I think it sounds like metadata, right?
Mm-hmm.
So shouldn't this be a element of the HSDS tab data standard that we then expose to the API? The API shouldn't have any content that isn't in the standard. And so if we want to think through how that data would be, then it should go into HSDS first, and then we should come up with an API endpoint for it.
I mean, I agree. I mean, I think HSDS definitely need like a last updated date as a minimum thing on the service to say, okay, if you're going to do that, then at least you can, and then an API endpoint with a listing to say what has changed since your last updated date, was like a minimal list, would be a way to not get all the data, but just get all the stuff you've had since last time. And this is something we've talked about before in terms of like a reconciliation sort of API, like a very, I just want an endpoint basically that's got a list of all the service IDs and the last updated date. And then I can reconcile from last time if any of them have been deleted or changed from the last
Yes,
one.
exactly.
Yeah, and then an updated date, so I can only go and pick out the ones that have updated since last time. We have discussed this as a, so the service list endpoint that we're discussing in this was hopefully going to have that last updated date in, and I was hoping that we could get a very minimal one of those. Mike's got one in Referral UK, which is like a limited service, but I always wanted one which is basically just the ID and the date as a possible one. We can discuss that when we go into the API proposal, but I think there are use cases that people do want to do a whole dump. They've got very minimal set and they just want to dump the whole lot again. And I think that we shouldn't stop smaller instances from doing that, because we can easily reconcile them. We can just do them. For bigger instances, obviously it doesn't work. Therefore, you need to have a different approach where you've got that other kind of endpoint with the listing. But I think I wouldn't want to say force everybody to have to do that last updated change stuff. Maybe we should, but I was thinking that was a bit too much of a burden for smaller instances, and that's why I didn't sort of explicitly say that on the proposal.
I mean, is this where the idea of descriptive profiles helps us, in that we support it in standard, we give you the tools to do it, but then we have a clear definition of, if you supply this and potentially some other stuff, then we know that your data is suitable for use in this way. And we say that some data isn't going to be reconcilable, and therefore it can't be used by people who need to do reconciling, and that massively limits its use. But we push that trade-off back out to the implementers. And if people like Kate are saying, I need to be able to reconcile your data, then we have a clearly defined, this is what you need to be able to do. But in context where that doesn't matter, we're not adding that overhead to people's implementations.
Can we use
Yes.
the existing metadata table for this and expose that to the API somehow? That may not be optimal. I'm not suggesting it as a viable solution. I'm just kind of curious.
From my perspective, like a last updated date in the standard would be great. Like just something simple like that could solve on the service level. But that doesn't mean just the service object has been updated. It means that anything related to that service, including the organization attached to anything within that graph, is when it's been updated within the whole chain of it. And that's what I think it should mean, rather than just this like thing on the service. So that's the subtlety. So you could have that last update against all the different tables as well. So every table could have that. Maybe that makes some sense. But I think you also want like an overall one saying this service is in some way changed, or this organization is in some way changed. Yeah.
So we have that in our system where we trickle up any of the lower, like the things in the tree up to the highest level. So each of the objects individually have modification dates, but then we have certain dates that through triggers like trickle up to the higher level objects so that we can trace that. And in some of the tools coming in where that isn't available, we actually take the latest date from all of the things in the tree and like surface that so that we can tell.
Okay, so
Right, and we do that too. I mean, I think that's a pretty, yeah, agreed.
So we have a metadata table that has, it says, it has a field for the field that's been modified, the previous value, the replacement value, and updated by and when it was updated. So I'm trying to figure out if we already have a metadata table that has fields like this, what's missing? And if the metadata table exists, could it be exposed through the API?
Well,
I'm
that's what I just
unclear.
asked, but the
Yeah.
metadata table is something that I've never seen implemented by anyone. And because they'd rather have that data denormalized to the record they're working with, pretty much.
I mean, I think there are two distinct approaches here. One is flag what's changed, and as Kate and Devin have pointed out, you know, there is a big job for people who are maintaining the data to ripple through. You know, if you make a change somewhere, like you change an organization, you're saying that all the services of that organization are treated as updated at the same time, and the same applies for lots of other associated data. So to maintain that updated date is an issue, but you know, is a simple way. And as well as having that in the profile, you also need an API filter parameter which says give me everything on or after that date or date time. That still doesn't take account of deletions. And the other approach is the metadata approach, as I understand it, that we don't think anybody's implemented, which, as I understand, is kind of a transaction log of every change that's ever happened. So much like if you're in a SQL database and you want to do a rollback, it just runs through those. Likewise, it's a set of changes that have been made, which would include deletions, but there's a massive overhead in maintaining that.
Yeah, there is.
You know, I think we need a pragmatic decision. And, you know, if Kate, if you're happy with the approach that we flag what's changed, then, you know, we just have to accept that if somebody's requiring that, they've got to take the responsibility for showing what's changed, or you've got to do what you do when you receive records. But can you tell us how you deal with something that's deleted?
Yeah, so again, really I use two endpoints. One is it uses a filter based on change, like since the last, to fetch what appears to be the changes since the last fetch. But then we also do a reconciliation after that is completed by getting the full list of what we expect our set to be. And here's the thing that becomes the real problem. It's not just about deletions. If you're using a filtered data set, meaning there's some criteria that means that you don't actually want the whole set and you're not synchronizing the whole set, something can be removed from the set without being deleted. And so tracking deletions is insufficient to meet the criteria. So instead, we return just it's a dead simple list of everything I expect to be in my set. Have the object, the ID, the modification information, and then we just say, do I have anything that is I think is supposed to be in this set and it's not? Well, then that's gone. Like I will mark it for deletion. And it's basic.
Yeah. So what I think we're concluding, and you know, in the absence of a whole meeting on reconciliation, is that if in a profile one needs to support this incremental update of the database rather than just reloading everything, we need that modified date that ripples down through all associated records. And we're still expecting the person reading to do a full read of all the services that they're expecting to see if any have disappeared since they last did a read. Yeah.
Yep.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, like I did data.gov sort of there, because they get feeds from all different sources, and we just had a list of basically IDs and last updated date, and they get the current list, and we had the last list, and we could tell which ones were deleted based on that, and therefore we deleted the ones that weren't there, and that was for the whole data, because even for like 1 million or something, you could store that all in memory. If you've just got those little bits of data, you wouldn't have it. You don't need that. You don't put everything. So that was like enough to do that, the deletions with. And I think, yeah, having that was always sort of in that list API, in the API, I think it should be in there. Like we should be allowed a very minimal one that's just got the ID and date. But yeah, it's like, does everybody have to do that is the question that I'm asking. Like, to get a minimal set, is that okay? So yeah, but I think, yeah, we should add that to the standard and have a good discussion about like standardized way of doing it, and then we can even build tooling and stuff off how we recommend you doing that reconciliation at some point.
I guess I mean, I like the sound of all this, of course. What I wonder is it something that we can push to 3.1 just so that this process doesn't become, you know, a forever process or just a longer process? I feel like we kind of settled on the tables. And so, you know, do we want to basically tack this on at the end? I mean, I'm not against it. I'm okay with it. Or do we want to kind of release what we've got, you know, now as a minimum viable, and then tackle kind of data replication, you know, basically tackle the more sophisticated use cases in the next round?
I'm in favor of MVP personally, you know, wholeheartedly. And with that though, like I'm volunteering to be a part of work groups to keep carrying on with some of these more difficult questions like immediately.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel the same. I mean, in the implementation that we have, you know, the OR services implementation, you know, we have last updated dates. We have various, we have tags for kind of controlling, filtering, you know, there's a bunch of other stuff I'm also very interested in related to kind of the management of data and the replication of data side, that I'm kind of holding back on right now because, you know, because I want us to get to 3.0 where we've done a lot of, you know, work in terms of slimming down the tables and all this other stuff and the API. So I'm more than eager to tackle this next set of challenge, you know, all of these other sophisticated use cases. But if we're keeping things, if the perspective of this, of getting to 3.0 is, you know, an update so that we can stream data out of these systems, then I feel like we should get that done and then move on to the more sophisticated work of managing the data, not just consuming the data.
So just with my governance hat on, I just want to check that we're not proposing anything in 3.1 that would be backwards incompatible with what we're talking about in 3.0, because that then makes it 4.0 that I don't think anyone wants. So as long as we're talking about exclusively additions, so new fields, fine, new API endpoints, fine, new stuff, new query parameters, fine. But as long as we're not talking about removing anything or changing the behavior of anything that exists, which I don't think we are, I think we're fine. But I just want to make sure that we're clear on that, because once we make 3.0, assuming we want to be internally consistent with our versioning, we can't then break it all again. So yeah, and I think we're fine from what I've just heard. I just want to check that everyone agrees with that assessment.
Yeah, I'm hearing only additive things. I don't hear that we actually have to remove or rename something so far.
And a lot of it is honestly just a view of existing data. We're not actually talking about even adding new data, just how it's presented.
I guess the sliding consistencies, we then have two ways to do the same thing again, in that we're keeping the existing metadata mechanism, even though no one uses it, and we're potentially adding a new synchronization mechanism. I think that's fine. I think it's a pragmatic choice. And I assume, David, we're baking in some kind of deprecation mechanism into 3.0 as we did for OCDS.
At least for fields anyway, we're gonna deprecate it, but we haven't decided exactly how we're gonna do that. But
yeah, so we can mark stuff like the existing metadata stuff in HSDS as for deprecation in 4.0 when we introduce the new stuff, which will be a zero impact change if no one's using it.
And just for a footnote to this whole thing, I do think that a data table is useful. I just think it's more useful for like audits than for real-time access. That's our planned use case for it.
Yeah, we use it internally and it's incredibly useful, but we don't use it for data exchange.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'd say that's the case for removing it from the standard, because the standard is an interchange standard. But that said, if there's value to synchronizing how people run the databases, I'm not averse to that. And I think we have, or we can invent community-based means for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think getting rid of it is interesting. I mean, we use it too as a log, and it's a beast. I mean, last I checked, over 20,000, logged items there, and it's a pain. And it's probably not part of the concept, right? Like, it's the concept is to make data available, not to make metadata available necessarily, not to make a metadata table available so that you can not have a log. So I mean, I think it is maybe that's where this conversation should go, into whether or not we actually should just deprecate that before we hit 3.0.
Now, here's a question then. Have we fleshed out the possibility of using it for reconciliation and exchange? Like, if there was an endpoint for that, and you could go query all the logs essentially and say, like, just tell me which service records were updated recently, and then I'll fetch them by ID. Maybe that's not such a bad idea. I haven't really thought that through.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting moving it in 3.0 because we haven't thought it through properly. But I think we can keep it in 3.0, mark it as for deprecation in 3.1, and then future us at some point when we look at 4.0 can ask them about actually removing it.
But
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
not to get too far off topic here. I mean, I think that, Kate, if it's okay with you, I mean, it looks like that the decision ahead of us is, do we add last updated around the standard now, and try to put together a new endpoint, or do we hit 3.0 and then do it for 3.1?
I am entirely flexible. I'm only wanting to make sure that I give my 2 cents for whatever it's worth. So.
Okay, so I'll pose that question to others then. I mean,
yeah, I'm fine with that.
I mean, if it's okay with folks, then I'd say let's just hit 3.0 and then add it in 3.1. Like, I 100% agree that we need it. I have it in my systems. It's pretty much I think it's an obviously good idea.
If everybody thinks it's a good idea and it's minimal, how long would it take to mock it up?
I think that the question arises then, which is the question we arise in our system as well, which is, yeah, do we put it on every table? Do we just put it on every table? Do we put it only on specific tables? And do we regulate how, like this cascading effect, right? Like, if you change contact's phone number, and that contact is associated with the service, does the last updated column, does that get updated, or is it only if the table gets updated?
Right, there's room. So Greg, I think the point being made here is there's room for us to make a decision here. It's not that the need is obvious. The exact way it's done is less obvious. For instance, we do it only at the major object level, and everything else is expected to roll up into that. Whereas someone else might say, for each table, we have the potential to say what we expect to be in it. That's a whole other level. So I think it does make sense to put a pin in it, understand it's really needed, and have a separate discussion about what makes sense.
Okay. I appreciate how multiple people in this group have talked themselves are entirely around their opinion through this conversation. That sounds very healthy. I think, to summarize, what we have now is potentially minimally viable. We know that there's some additional needs. We know it's a direction we want to go, but it's not necessarily immediately obvious how we want to get there. And we think it's okay to proceed as is for 3.0 and put this at the top of our agenda for 3.1. Is that, have we got consensus on that so far? Okay, I'm seeing nods. Okay. And I know that Skylar is doing work on this reconciliation process right now. I've got a line of sight into that project. So Skylar, if you're satisfied with how this is played out, then I don't see your face, but I trust you on that. So. Okay. So let's see if, so this issue has been raised, prioritized, and tabled. Thank you, Kate. Mike, if I can recap what I think we discussed, basically after last week's meeting, you and Ian came and said, you know, we've got a bunch of APIs up and we told people that to be compliant, you need to have an API for at least Open Referral UK, and so we can validate it. And you're saying, you know, you were raising this because the prospect of people publishing data packages and instead of an API, you know, maybe poses interoperability challenges. Have I got that right, Mike? Was that?
Yeah. I mean, and I wasn't in last time's meeting, but Ian raised the concern, which is mine, that, you know, if we've got these three options, you know, 2 in green, 1 in yellow for what the data looks like. As far as we're concerned in the UK, we don't want somebody to say, well, we've got a data in a database, and if you asked for it as a JSON package, we could send it to you. We are thereby compliant. That would be useless for us, and I could well see suppliers pretending they were compliant in order to do that and get round genuine sharing. So we wanted to be quite explicit that whatever suits us internationally, you know, nationally, we'd like to feel that, you know, a JSON schema, and as David's described when we get to the API, a list of, of a schema for services and a schema for individual service is what we are expecting. And I'll stick it in the document. I did a forum post, which just basically is, you know, what constitutes compliance in the UK. And I wanted to do that quite quickly because we're now getting suppliers saying, you know, what should it look like? And, you know, at present, we've got a dashboard which with entries which pass or fail from open API feeds. And we've got a web page which describes what validations we're doing. And if we're going to update the spec and say that, well, we want certain web methods supported against and returning responses that comply with a particular schema, we just need to be very explicit about that. And, you know, irrespective of what others do, you know, elsewhere, I think if we can say there is this minimum set of API calls, and this is what we want the responses to look like, that's really all I care about. And what that minimum set is subject to discussion. And I put in a document what I thought that might be. And I think to some extent, Kate is right that it is too much of a minimum. And I put in that forum an argument for including taxonomies and taxonomy terms, because if somebody is configuring a search tool, they might want to read those. But I mean, that's up for discussion. But the absolute minimum for me is that we say, you know, in the UK, we expect people to support what I would call services rather than service, David, but that's open to discussion. Services API call and a services ID API, and we're quite strict as to what the response looks like.
So before we get, let me just summarize my response to Mike, and hear if Mike agrees with my response to the framing before we go to others. So Skylar, please hold that thought. My response to Mike was essentially threefold. One, we want to be able to make tooling for conversion that could minimize the hit to interoperability. If somebody publishes a data package, there's tooling to be able to convert the data package to a JSON endpoint, hypothetically at least. Two, you know, this is potentially something that Open Referral UK, you know, could say, well, the standard overall is permissive to this degree, and our commitments are more restrictive. You know, we actually do require an API endpoint to be compliant at that level with Open Referral UK's profile or what have you, or local governance policies. And I forget what the third was actually now. but Mike, those 2 points, I'm not sure that the first one is convincing to you, but the second one seems to be legit, that you all, is that right? Can you respond on both fronts? Yeah.
Second one I like. The first one, well, you know, who's going to provide that service that does the transformation from one to the other? You know, if we're I'm concerned that we've got, you know, relatively dumb recipients of data. We're using, you know, we want to avoid bespoke connectors to convert data. Well, this is only one off in that we're saying if somebody chooses to interpret the standard in one way, they've got to run some third-party code on their own servers, or they're relying on Open Referral to provide that as a permanent online live conversion tool in order to get it into a format that is usable. So much as I can see there might be a need for that code, you know, internationally, I would rather throw back to, you know, our developers and individual suppliers the requirement to just match the API and not require somebody else to convert their outputs.
I think that's what we're working towards with the restricting model for profiles or extensions or whatever we land on calling them. I think it's as long as all those endpoints do validate against the broader international specification, it's fine to say Open Referral UK only accepts this limited range of inputs, and that's just the API ones and just a subset of the API ones. And layered on top of that, there's additional fields, there's particular implementations, additional validation rules, all the stuff that makes it useful in the UK context. So I think we're working towards that. I think that's the extensions profiles mechanism that I have in mind. And it maintains a degree of interoperability. So something that's written to work with any Open Referral data will work with that data. So it's valid in that sense. But in reality, it's going to be local implementations talking to each other and doing it in the same way and being expressed in the same language, so that we're clear this is what the UK means by this. I think that's what we're working towards, and I think that's a better solution than tooling, conversion tooling.
Yeah, so I'd like, yeah, can you guys hear me okay? My connection's kind of taking a dump right now.
Go for it, Skylar.
I understand this, it's just important to know that name it.
We cannot hear you okay now.
Skylar, you broke up. Skylar, maybe you can, while you're fiddling, maybe get it into the chat. And Mike, you were about to say something?
Yeah, all I just want to say is, yes, Rob, yeah, that sounds great. People often drop the UK. They just talk about Open Referral in the UK rather than Open Referral UK. And I just want to make it perfectly clear, you know, in the documentation, we don't want people saying, well, we're Open Referral compliant, but we may not be Open Referral UK compliant. We just want, you know, I just want the documentation to be very explicit that in many implementations, particularly in the UK, people will be expecting the API feed, not just a data package.
I think the UK is a special case, so we can intercept that at the start and say, if you're in the UK and implementing Open Referral, go here, look at the Open Referral UK documentation, because I think the UK has a big enough and high profile enough implementation to warrant that kind of special treatment. Right. And then as and when we see other ones, we can add them in, like we can get some information architecture off the docs. And obviously, ultimately, we're hoping to merge content and documentation the like, so on the whole it's all the same set. Yeah, so
right. Well, Mike, what is it that you're not getting right now that you want?
Well,
is it
I just don't want anyone to think they are compliant by having an Open Referral database which they could dump as a JSON package but not have available via an API.
Yeah, can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, let's try this one more time. So this is important. I'm going to contribute thoughts for future discussion here, because we would prefer, I personally would prefer to not include data package, you know, as part of the spec, except that we just can't get around it in certain edge cases in the US, in the cases of rural, poorly funded or temporary organizations contributing data, which are all legitimate. and that's all the more that they can cobble together. And I'm kind of wondering, but here's what I'm concerned about. I know of certain wily corporations that we have to deal with who are going to always go for the absolute minimum viability of a specification and then still undershoot it and claim that they're HSDS compliant. And I kind of want to put them in a box, just on this side of the pond. So I almost wonder if we don't kind of create a couple of levels of the standard and put rigorous, guidance or documentation around this to say, here's the absolute minimum viability. This is intended, this data package is intended for small, underfunded, rural, temporary disaster relief, whatever kind of scenarios. But then if you're even remotely, software solution, enterprise level, government funded, whatever, like this is what we expect. This is standards here, the gold standard. You need to be API compliant.
So that I'm sorry, I'm giggling here while I'm muted because I totally get where you're coming from here. So what if you approached it, so we had an official minimum that was a bit more beefy, but then you had a sort of an emergency or limited standard that was less. That way you make it sound like you phrase the less complete minimal in a way that sounds inadequate. That will help prevent that. It can honestly just be a matter of naming that extra tiny semi-useless version in a way that will prevent people from wanting to advertise themselves that way, if you know what I mean.
Okay,
I think
so
you can do that.
Let me see if I can.
Yeah, I think that this seems solvable completely with like an appropriate sentence. And I think that, in the past, up until now, we've had HSDS and HSDA, right? HSDS was basically the data package, and HSDA was the API that no one used. And so I think what I'm hearing from Mike is that we want to be able to say open referral compatible means you're using the API. And if you're not using the API, but you just have a data packet, and I'm completely fine with that. But I think that we should also, right? So maybe we just do that and say open referral compatible means you're using the API, and this is how. But if you can't make an API, then at the very least, you should make a data package so that you could easily produce the API or use it internally, and here's the data package. Would that solve your objection, or would that solve your issue, Mike?
Yeah, it sounds like it solved everyone's issues, because I think you've got the same problem as us with the big suppliers not wanting to play ball. So yes, excellent.
And I think if that's the case, then I think the other question, then going the other direction, do we want to enforce the data package? Because that means basically enforcing bulk data access, and not like the big suppliers. And tell me if I'm wrong, Skylar, from your perspective, that the big suppliers here would like to put their content into an API and then limit that API in various ways to just make sure that the bulk data is not available. And a data package solves that by making that data all available.
Yeah, that's part of it. I was actually thinking of the opposite case. Well, they'll be like, I'll just throw this in a data package, not make it accessible via API, and just walk away from it. But
just say like, hey, trust us, we have a data package and we can show you a sample, but we're not going to give you the actual data.
It depends on what makes them more money. If it makes them more
Right.
money not to do the technical work to implement the API, that's what they will do. If it makes them more money to hold the data hostage, that is what they will do. It's whatever works for them.
And I think one thing that we haven't tackled is, actually data accessibility, right? Like, we're not saying to be open referral compatible, we need, you cannot use the open referral compatible brand label, which also we don't have and probably is not trademarked, right? We're not saying like you cannot put that on your website unless
we have
you make
filed
all
for
of your data
trademarking.
available.
By the way, we have filed for trademark registration in the US, and that will extend to the UK.
Yeah, we might need to extend it to open referral with a compatible concept, not just open referral as a trademark.
Yeah.
But I think we're getting, once again, this is another great set of content for 3.1. But which is like, how do we want to really communicate and make sure that we're getting the most out of vendors, and they can't manipulate this. But I think that I feel like I was probably the biggest advocate for data packages being included as my clients are exactly the type Skylar's talking about. But I'm 100% happy with serving Mike's need here and saying, being open referral compatible means having the API.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
However, we also offer a data package. However, if you're going to do bulk transfer through file, like we suggest doing a data package, and then we simply just build a tool, which, we'll build, I think is one of the first tools we'll build, which is taking a data package and turning it into an API endpoint. And we can make that an easy open source software product and maybe even host it somewhere at some point.
Okay, we're basically out of time. I'm a little concerned because we've waffled into and out of agreement with the current proposal on the table. And I thought we were like, okay, we agree because Open Referral UK can make a more specific requirement. And now it seems like maybe there's some thought that we should actually have the requirement be an API, but offer guidance for data package publishing. So I'm not entirely sure where this landed. I'm gonna depend on Open Data Services Co-op coming out with a summary and a proposal. But I think we are at the level where I think you all have what you need to make that proposal. And we can, Kate's saying she's not available again until after January. I think we could potentially have another work group meeting 2 weeks from now before the end of the year. So I'm going to have Open Data Services Co-op see if they can come forth with a proposal. I'm going to ask you all to respond over email with your availability potentially for December 19th. Kate, if we have to do this one without you, but there are sufficient and other people.
Sorry,
I
have 2 funding things closing
Yeah,
at the end of the year.
I got
Sorry.
you. You're good. Your contribution has been invaluable. Thank you. We will see over email whether we're going to try to have another meeting at the end of the year to land on anything. And also, we're going to start moving this conversation to whatever point, I think, online. We're going to push things to the forum. So bear with us as we potentially schedule one more for the end of the year and or start moving things into the forum and out into the broader community. So we haven't touched on some of the minor details, it seems like, around API specification, but it does seem like people think that they are minor. Obviously, we have big questions about the tooling, but I think we are close. Is that right? Everybody feeling all right? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think we landed on, we don't want a situation where Open Referral UK has to say, here's extra stuff. That we're comfortable with it being the API being required, and that the data package is basically optional. And it's optional. And if you can't make the API, then your next best step is to make the data package.
Okay.
And that we don't want to edit any data fields. We don't want to add any new fields to the thing right now, but that in 3.1, we're going to add some updated fields, and we're going to tackle the use case around metadata and data reconciliation, et cetera.
Okay. I'm seeing nods from David and Rob and Dan. Obviously, this recommendation has to go from the work group to the broader community. But it seems like we have consensus in the work group so far. We are going to affirm that consensus, hopefully over email, before then pushing it out to the broader community. And then we'll see what other feedback we can get and whether that means that we have to come back to the drawing board. All right. Okay, thank you, everybody. Woo.
We're getting there.
We are still asymptotically approaching the API conversation. All right. Talk to y'all later, potentially in 2 weeks from today. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.